There is an island in the Chesapeake Bay that is disappearing. Not slowly, in the geological sense that all coastlines shift over millennia. Disappearing on a human timescale, measurably, visibly, within the lifetime of the people who live on it. Since 1850, 2/3 of its land has gone underwater. The graveyard on its north shore, where generations of families buried their dead, has been swallowed by the bay. Headstones that stood on solid ground 100 years ago now sit on the bottom of the Chesapeake, in water that has slowly claimed them, foot by foot, year by year, with a patience that has no interest in the lives being lived above it. Approximately 400 people still live on that island. They were born there. Their parents were born there. Their grandparents were born there. Some of them can trace their family's presence on that island back to 1686, which means their ancestors were farming that land before the United States existed, before the Revolution was fought, before the Constitution was written. They speak with an accent that linguists have traced to 17th century Cornwall, England, a dialect that survived because the island was cut off from the mainland long enough for the language to develop its own character. Americans who hear it think it sounds British. British people who hear it think it sounds American. The islanders think everyone else sounds wrong. The ferry from Reedville, Virginia takes 2.5 hours. There is no bridge. There is no airport of any significance. The roads are wide enough for golf carts, which is what most people use to get around, because the island is too small for the kind of car culture that the rest of America built its 20th century around. The watermen go out for crabs before dawn and come back in the afternoon, the same way they have been going out and coming back on this water since 1686. That island is Tangier Island, and it is one of 8 places on this list. America has approximately 94,000 miles of coastline. It has thousands of islands, some inhabited, most not, some accessible by bridge, some by ferry, some by boat only. But the number of islands that are genuinely remote, genuinely unchanged, genuinely resistant to the kind of development and modernization that has transformed virtually every other piece of desirable coastal real estate in the country is very small. And it is getting smaller every year. This list covers 8 of those places. What they share is not that they are picturesque. Most of them are, but that is incidental. What they share is that the modern world arrived at the water's edge and then, for reasons specific to each place, stopped. Some of them were protected deliberately by people who understood what they were protecting. Some of them survived by accident, the economic collapse that prevented development, the ferry schedule that made them inconvenient enough to discourage the wrong kind of attention. Some of them are sinking. Some are thriving in their isolation. One of them may not exist in 30 years. By the time this list ends, you will know things about the American coastline that most Americans who live near it have never been told. Little Cranberry Island is one of 5 islands that make up the town of Cranberry Isles in Lincoln County, Maine, lying roughly 4 miles off the southern shore of Mount Desert Island in the Gulf of Maine. It has a postal designation, Islesford, zip code 04646, which is one of the more quietly remarkable facts about it. An island so small it barely registers on most maps has its own zip code, its own post office, its own school, its own ferry dock. An island of 200 acres has the infrastructure of a town, because it is one, has been one since the 18th century, will be one as long as the people who remain decide to remain. The year-round population is approximately 60 people. In the summer, that number climbs to several hundred, because Little Cranberry attracts the specific kind of visitor who knows what they're looking for. Quiet water, working coastline, no chain stores, no crowds, no traffic, the particular quality of life that only exists when the ferry schedule is the primary constraint on your day. The summer people are not unwelcome, but they are understood, by both sides, to be temporary. The 60 who stay through Maine's winter, when the ferry schedule thins, and the Gulf of Maine can close in for days at a time, and the coast becomes what it actually is, rather than what it looks like in photographs taken in July. Those are the people the island is made of. The first permanent European settler was Benjamin Sperling, who arrived in 1768 from the mainland and found what the Abenaki people had known for centuries before him: exceptionally rich fishing grounds, sheltered coves, and the kind of cold, clear water that produces lobster in quantities that, once you have committed to fishing it, are sufficient reason to stay. The Abenaki had been coming to the Cranberry Isles area for seasonal fishing and food gathering long before the 18th century, and the productivity of the waters that drew them is the same productivity that drew Sperling and every subsequent resident who decided the ferry crossing was worth it for the life on the other side. The Sperlings stayed. The Stanleys came. The Bunkers arrived. The Fernald family took root. These names are still on the island today, on fishing boats, on mailboxes, on the K-8 school that serves the island's children before they are old enough to take the daily ferry to Mount Desert Island for high school. That ferry, in rough weather, requires more than casual commitment. Maine winter weather is serious weather. The commitment required to get a teenager to high school on a day when the Gulf of Maine is demonstrating what it can do in January is not a commitment that everyone is willing to make, and it is one of the specific ways in which island life selects, over generations, for a particular kind of person. Over a quarter of Cranberry Isles residents are employed in the resource extraction industry, which here means lobster fishing, almost exclusively. Lobster fishing from Little Cranberry Island in 2026 is done with modern equipment: GPS plotters, hydraulic haulers, diesel engines, sonar technology that the island's founding fishermen could not have imagined. But the lobster is still in the same water. The traps still go down and come up. The day still begins before dawn. The work still follows the tides and the seasons in the same fundamental rhythm it has followed for 250 years. Stephen Hillenberg, the marine science educator who would later create SpongeBob SquarePants, worked on Islesford in the 1980s as an educator. The tiny island that had no paved roads and arrived only by mailboat is, in part, where he developed the underwater world observations that eventually became one of the most successful animated franchises in television history. He came from the mainland. He went back to the mainland. The 60 people who stay through January are still there. The Islesford Historical Museum holds the charts and tools and photographs of the island's founding families, objects that are not the artifacts of a distant civilization, but the belongings of the grandparents of people alive on the island right now, living on the same water, fishing the same lobster, taking the same ferry when the weather allows, and waiting when it doesn't. There are things in the Islesford Historical Museum that tell you exactly what it was like to live here in 1820. And if you walk out of the museum and look at the harbor, the difference between then and now is smaller than you would expect. The boats are different, the technology is different, but the harbor is the same harbor, and the water is the same water, and the pattern of the day is still set by what the Gulf of Maine decides to do. 12 nautical miles off the Maine coast, in the Gulf of Maine, Monhegan Island is far enough from land that crossing it seriously in rough weather is a different proposition from the relatively protected ferry runs closer to shore. The island is 0.85 square miles. The year-round population in the 2020 census was 64 people. The population has remained roughly in that range since the 1830s, occasionally dipping lower and occasionally climbing slightly, but never departing far from the number that this particular piece of exposed granite in the North Atlantic can sustain year-round through its combination of lobster fishing and, more recently, tourism. There are no cars on Monhegan Island. There are no paved roads. There is a lighthouse, built in 1824, still operational, though unmanned, since 1959, sitting on the island's highest point where it can cast its light across the greatest possible arc of open water. There is a one-room schoolhouse. There is no police department, no bank, no doctor's office. Ferries run year-round from Port Clyde, a crossing that takes approximately 1 hour, and in winter the service runs 3 times a week. The island's permanent population of 64 lives for stretches of winter, in a degree of isolation that is unusual even by main island standards. The Abenaki people called this place by a word that translates variously as out-to-sea island, a description so accurate that it has survived in common usage alongside the European names that were overlaid on it. John Cabot, the Venetian explorer sailing for England, documented the island's position in 1498. Basque, Breton, and Portuguese fishermen were likely using it as a fishing station before him in the late 15th century, without leaving any written record, their presence inferred from tools found in subsequent archaeological work. Captain John Smith landed in 1614 and wrote about the fishing grounds in terms that brought subsequent English fishermen across the ocean. Permanent settlement dates to 1674, after the various colonial wars had made the island temporarily uninhabitable, and then, when peace came, had repopulated it with people who found that the isolation was a feature rather than a bug. The fishing was exceptional. The cliffs were dramatic. The location was remote enough to offer a particular kind of life that the mainland couldn't provide. People came, and some of them stayed, and their descendants are among the 64 who are there in January, when the ferry runs 3 times a week. What made Monhegan famous, in a way that most small Maine fishing islands never became famous, was the artists. Aaron Draper Shattuck arrived in the 1850s and wrote about the island's beautiful coves and grand cliffs rising high out of the sea. He was followed, over the next half-century, by a roster that reads like a history of American landscape painting. Rockwell Kent, who built a cottage and studio on Monhegan in 1906 and 1910, and produced paintings that defined how the island looked in the American imagination. Robert Henry, who brought his students and established the island as a teaching destination. Edward Hopper, who came repeatedly and produced sketches and paintings of the island's particular light, the light of a piece of exposed rock 12 miles off the Maine coast, where the sky and the water and the stone interact in ways that photographers and painters have been trying to capture since the 1850s, without ever entirely succeeding. George Bellows, who painted the cliffs in a way that made them look like the edge of the world, which from certain angles they are. Theodore Edison, son of Thomas Edison, who had spent childhood summers on Monhegan and understood what the island was before anyone had put a formal value on it, became concerned in the early 1950s that the development he had watched transform other Maine coastline would reach Monhegan and alter what had made it compelling to the painters and to the fishermen alike. In 1954, he established Monhegan Associates, a private nonprofit organization that now owns and maintains more than 300 acres of the island's wildlands, more than half the island's total land area, as permanently protected open space. The organization holds the land in trust, which means that the particular character of Monhegan's landscape, the 150-foot Blackhead Cliffs on the north side, Cathedral Woods where the tree branches arch overhead, Lobster Cove at the southern end, will not become hotel property or private residential development. It will stay what it is. The fishing still happens. The lobster season on Monhegan has a specific character. The island has historically managed its own fishery, with informal agreements among the fishermen about when traps go in and when they come up, that long predate the formal state regulations that now govern lobster fishing across Maine. The traps go out, the traps come up. The day begins before dawn. The lobster goes to market. The 1824 lighthouse still marks the island for vessels crossing the Gulf of Maine at night. The 64 year-round residents go about their business. The ferry runs 3 times a week in winter, and more frequently in summer, when the population swells with day trippers and summer residents. There is little internet. The rooms in some of the older accommodations have no phones. Monhegan Island has no bank. Its accommodations date, in some cases, to the 19th century, when the first summer visitors were arriving and finding, in the same thing that the fishermen had been living with, something worth coming back to. The painters came because of the light. The light is still there. Drive south from Nag's Head, along North Carolina's Outer Banks, and you eventually reach Hatteras Island, where the road ends and the ferry begins. An hour on the ferry, crossing Pamlico Sound, and you arrive at Ocracoke Village, the only settlement on Ocracoke Island. The village has approximately 900 permanent residents. The island is 16 miles long. There is no bridge connecting it to the mainland. There has never been one. Electricity didn't arrive on Ocracoke Island until 1938. A regular ferry service didn't begin until 1957. Before those two dates, the people of Ocracoke were connected to the rest of North Carolina only by the occasional supply boat and whatever their own vessels could manage. For roughly 200 years, from permanent settlement in the 1750s to the arrival of the ferry in 1957, the community on Ocracoke Island developed in near total isolation from the mainland, and that isolation did something to the language that no other place in North Carolina experienced in quite the same way. The Ocracoke Brogue, known locally as Hoy Toiter, from the way islanders have historically pronounced high tide, is a dialect of English that exists nowhere else on Earth. Linguists who study it describe it as a blend of 17th and 18th century British English from Ireland, Eastern England, and southwestern England, particularly Cornwall and Devon, filtered through 200 years of geographic isolation, mixed with elements of Southern American English and traces of other influences that arrived on occasional vessels over 2 centuries and stayed. The result is a dialect that has its own grammar, its own vocabulary, its own rhythm that sounds simultaneously familiar and entirely strange to everyone who hears it from outside. Americans who hear the Ocracoke Brogue think it sounds British. British people who hear it think it sounds vaguely familiar, but wrong. People from Georgia hear a southern twang in it. People from London hear something pre-Georgian. It is, in fact, all of these things and none of them. A language that developed its own character in a place cut off from the mainland long enough for that development to produce something irreversible. The dialect has specific vocabulary that exists nowhere else. A dingbatter is anyone not from Ocracoke, a tourist, a mainlander, anyone who doesn't belong to the island's particular understanding of the world. An oacocker is someone born on Ocracoke. A buck is a good male friend. A puck is a female friend. You go up the beach when you leave the island for the mainland. The brogue uses weren't liberally for singular subjects. The sun weren't out yesterday. It adds an A in front of verbs as a matter of habit. We went a-fishin' this mornin'. Children on Ocracoke play me-honky, hide and seek at night, a word that exists in no other dialect of English anywhere. For 10 generations, the same family names have been on Ocracoke: Bragg, Gaskins, Howard, Jackson, Styron, Williams, O'Neill, Scarborough. These names are not the last holdouts of a disappearing culture. They are the names of the original settlers and their direct descendants, in an unbroken line that goes back to when this island had no electricity, no regular mail service, no bridge, no connection to the rest of North Carolina, except by water. Blackbeard, the pirate Edward Teach, the most feared pirate in American colonial history, used Ocracoke Inlet as his base of operations. The inlet's shallow waters, which the island's fishermen knew by heart, were navigable to them and a death trap to strangers. Blackbeard was killed at Ocracoke Inlet on November 22, 1718, by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy, who had to learn the inlet's geography the hard way. Blackbeard ran his ship Adventure aground in the shallow water. Maynard's men boarded. A fight of extraordinary violence followed. Blackbeard reportedly sustained 5 gunshot wounds and 20 sword cuts before falling. His head was cut off and hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's vessel as proof that the most famous pirate in the Atlantic was dead. The inlet where this happened is still there. The village that grew up near it is still there. The brogue that developed in 200 years of near isolation is still spoken by fewer people every year, as the summer population of 5,000 tourists introduces the island to the rest of the world's accents. and the young people leave for opportunities that don't exist on a 16-mile barrier island, but still recognizably, still distinctly, still there. A man named Chester Lynn, whose family has been on Ocracoke for 10 generations, runs a florist and antiques shop on the island. When visitors ask him where he's from, he says right here, and when they laugh at the directness of it, he offers a line he has refined over years of practice. "I've been here long enough to catch fish in the front yard with a garden rake." The ferry still runs from Hatteras Island to Ocracoke Village, an hour each way, the only way in or out without a private boat. The inlet where Blackbeard was killed in 1718 is still shallow in the same places. The Brogue is still spoken by the descendants of families who were here before America was a country, in a village that got its first electricity in 1938 and its first regular ferry service in 1957, and has been trying to manage the consequences of connectivity ever since. Cumberland Island is Georgia's largest barrier island, 17.5 miles long, up to 3 miles wide, 36,000 acres of maritime forest, salt marsh, ancient dune, and 18 miles of beach. There is no bridge to it. There are no paved roads on it. The National Park Service limits daily visitors to 300 people, which on a 36,000-acre island means that at most moments, the person-to-acre ratio is approximately 1 to 120. You can walk the beach for hours and see no one. You can walk through maritime forest of live oak and sabal palm and longleaf pine and see nothing but the forest. Or you can see the horses. Approximately 100 to 200 feral horses roam Cumberland Island, descendants of domestic horses brought by various owners over the island's long history, now living completely wild in a landscape that has reverted to something close to its pre-human character. They graze on the open ground near the Dungeness ruins, what remains of the Carnegie family's Gilded Age mansion, as if the buildings and the money and the family that built them are simply part of the landscape they occupy, which, at this point, they more or less are. The story of how Cumberland Island became what it is requires going back through layers of history that are unusually dense, even by the standards of the American South. The Timucua people lived on Cumberland Island for centuries before European contact. Spanish missionaries arrived in 1566, establishing the first permanent European settlement in Georgia, predating Jamestown by 41 years, and the Pilgrims at Plymouth by 54. The Spanish mission system operated on the island for more than a century before the early 18th century collapse of Spanish colonial power in Georgia. The ruins of those missions are somewhere beneath the island's soil. James Oglethorpe, who founded the colony of Georgia in 1733, built a hunting lodge on the island's southern end in 1736 and named it Dungeness, after a headland in Kent, England. The name survived through subsequent buildings and subsequent owners, including the one that matters most for the island's current character, Thomas Carnegie, younger brother of Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, purchased most of Cumberland Island in the 1880s and built the kind of estate that only the Gilded Age's most spectacular fortunes could produce. The Dungeness mansion that his wife Lucy Carnegie built after Thomas's death in 1886 was a 40-room Queen Anne structure with a swimming pool, a golf course, formal gardens, and facilities for approximately 200 servants. It was the largest private residence in Georgia. Lucy Carnegie died in 1916. The family gradually moved out of the island. In 1959, the Dungeness mansion burned in a fire that was widely alleged to be arson, the circumstances of which were never conclusively established. The National Park Service acquired the ruins in 1972. What remains of Dungeness today is one of the most visually striking ruins in the United States. Brick walls, stone columns, archways, still standing, still grand in their scale, now threaded with ivy and surrounded by the lawn that the feral horses graze, with complete indifference to the historical significance of what they're walking through. On foggy mornings, when the Georgia coast mist moves through the ruined chambers and the horses stand in the space where the ballroom used to be, The effect defies easy description. The island's most famous recent event is connected to a small wooden church at its northern end. The first African Baptist church on Cumberland Island was built in 1937 on the foundations of an earlier structure by the descendants of the people who had been enslaved on the island's plantations. The church has no electricity. It seats a small congregation. In September 1996, John F. Kennedy Jr. married Carolyn Bessette in this church, in a ceremony so secret that the press didn't know about it until after it happened. The only celebrity wedding venue in America that has no electricity and is accessible only by boat. The reason Cumberland Island is what it is today, rather than what Hilton Head Island, South Carolina became, is a decision made in a brief window of time in 1970 and 1972. In 1968, a developer named Charles Fraser, who had developed Hilton Head, purchased 3,000 acres from Carnegie Heirs and began clearing land for an airstrip and roads. The Georgia Conservancy alerted newspapers. The resulting public attention led to President Nixon signing the law creating Cumberland Island National Seashore on October 23, 1972. Fraser's airstrip was never completed. The roads were never built. Cumberland Island exists as it does today because a conservation organization noticed what was happening in 1970 and did something about it before the window closed. The 300-person daily limit has held. The ferry from St. Mary's, Georgia, is the only way in. The horses are still on the Carnegie lawn. The church where JFK Jr. got married still has no electricity. The ruins of the mansion that was the largest private house in Georgia are still standing. The beach, 18 miles of it, the longest undeveloped beach on the East Coast, is still there. Smith Island is the last inhabited offshore island in Maryland that has no road connection to the mainland. The first permanent settlers arrived in 1686, English, Welsh, and Cornish families who came to the Chesapeake Bay looking for land and found the island's extraordinary crabbing and oystering grounds sufficient reason to stay. The island was named for Henry Smith of Jamestown, who had been granted 1,000 acres of Maryland land in 1679. Some of those earliest settlers' surnames, Evans, Tyler, are still on the island today. One current resident, Eddie Evans, has traced his family's continuous presence on Smith Island back 13 generations. The peak population was approximately 800 people in the early 20th century. Today, approximately 220 people live on the island year-round, spread across 3 communities, Ewell, Rhodes Point, and Tylerton, that sit on separate pieces of ground connected by waterways the watermen called ditches and guts. These channels, which were once narrow enough to step across, are now wide enough for boats to sail through easily. The island has been losing ground to erosion and rising water for centuries, and the rate of loss is accelerating. The most famous product of Smith Island is its cake, and the story of the cake is the story of the island. The Smith Island cake, a multi-layer confection that became the official state dessert of Maryland by legislative act in 2008, was invented on Smith Island in the 1800s for a reason specific to the conditions of island life in that era. The watermen went out onto the Chesapeake for the autumn oyster harvest and might not return for a week or more. Their wives made cakes to send with them. The island had no electricity until the 1950s, which meant no refrigeration, which meant the frosting could not contain butter without spoiling. The original Smith Island cake frosting was sugar and chocolate, shelf-stable ingredients that would survive a week on the water without refrigeration. The reason for the layers: proper Smith Island cake has at minimum 7, and serious versions reach 10, 12 or more, is still slightly mysterious. The most frequently offered explanation is that without electricity, the island's women cooked on wood-burning ovens that couldn't sustain consistent enough heat to raise a tall single cake layer. Multiple thin layers, each baked quickly and separately, then assembled with frosting between each one, solved the problem. The cake was a technological adaptation to specific constraints. Those constraints no longer exist. Smith Island has had electricity since the 1950s, but the cake has been maintained because it became, over the 19th and 20th centuries, the edible identity of a place that has maintained its identity against considerable odds. The island has its own dialect, related to, but distinct from, the Ocracoke Brogue, with features that linguists trace to the 17th and 18th century Cornish and Welsh settlers who came from the West Country of England and brought their speech patterns with them. A linguist who visited Smith Island in the 1870s described the inhabitants as speaking a curious blend of archaic English and maritime vocabulary that would be at home in a Cornish fishing village of the previous century. 150 years later, the dialect is still audible, still recognizable to linguists who study it, still carrying features that arrived from Cornwall and Wales in 1686 and have been maintained through isolation. The island's religious character was shaped by a man named Joshua Thomas, a Methodist preacher who traveled the Chesapeake Bay Islands in the early 19th century in a log canoe, converting communities that had significant histories of piracy. The isolated waterways of the Chesapeake offered natural cover for it, to Methodism, through preaching that, by all accounts, combined theatrical force with genuine conviction. Thomas was so effective that he is credited with essentially eliminating piracy from the Chesapeake Bay through religious persuasion alone. Smith Island has been devoutly Methodist ever since. The crab pots don't go out on Sunday. They haven't for generations. The rest of Maryland's crabbing industry does what it does on Sunday. Smith Island doesn't. The watermen who remain harvest blue crabs by trotline and oysters by scraper, methods that have not fundamentally changed in their essentials since the 19th century. The soft-shell crabs of Smith Island, blue crabs caught in the brief window between when they shed their old shell and when the new shell hardens, a period of hours that the island's watermen have learned to identify with a precision that comes only from generations of close observation, are considered among the finest in the Chesapeake. The knowledge of how to catch them, how to hold them through the molt, how to get them to market in the brief window during which they're sellable, is not written down anywhere. It exists in the practice of the people who do it. Smith Island is sinking. The Maryland side, the inhabited portion, is approximately 900 acres of inhabitable ground within an island complex of 8,000 total acres. The waterways that were once narrow ditches are now wide enough for boats. Scientists estimate that without significant intervention, Smith Island will be largely uninhabitable by 2050. The families whose surnames are on the headstones in Ewell's churchyard, Bradshaw, Summers, Evans, Corbin, are still on the island, still crabbing, still not going out on Sunday, still making the cake. Tangier Island sits 12 miles off the eastern shore of Virginia, in the Chesapeake Bay, in a position that makes it simultaneously adjacent to one of the most densely developed corridors in the eastern United States, the stretch from Washington, D.C. to Norfolk, and about as remote, in practical terms, as any inhabited place within the contiguous United States can be. The ferry from Reedville, Virginia, takes 2.5 hours each way and runs once daily in season. There is a small airstrip, built in 1969, on the western edge of the island, capable of handling small propeller aircraft. There is no bridge. There are no cars in the ordinary sense of personal automobiles. Residents travel by golf cart, by foot, by bicycle, and by boat. The island's roads are wide enough for 2 golf carts to pass each other, which represents the dimension around which Tangier's entire transportation infrastructure is built. Captain John Smith noted the island's existence in 1608 during his exploration of the Chesapeake Bay, calling it the Russell's Isles. Spanish navigators had documented it before him. The first permanent settlers arrived in 1686. By tradition, the Crockett family from Cornwall, England, though the precise documentary record of the founding is incomplete in the way that 17th century records tend to be. What is not incomplete is the continuity. The Crockett name is still on Tangier Island in 2026. At its peak, Tangier Island had a population approaching 2,000. By 2000, the number had fallen to approximately 600. Today it stands at approximately 400, with a median age that skews increasingly old as the young leave for economic opportunities that simply don't exist on a disappearing island in the Chesapeake Bay. The economy is built almost entirely on crabs. Tangier is known as the soft-shell crab capital of the world, a designation that is accurate rather than promotional. The watermen who work the Chesapeake from Tangier do so the same way their families have been working it since 1686, from small boats, using knowledge of the water that is accumulated over a lifetime and passed from parent to child in the informal way that all practical knowledge passes in a community small enough that everyone learns from everyone else. The dialect of Tangier Island, like the dialects of Smith Island and Ocracoke, is a form of English shaped by geographic isolation into something that doesn't exist anywhere else. Linguists describe it as carrying features traceable to 17th century Cornish speech. The island's founding families came from Cornwall, brought their speech patterns with them, and 3 centuries of isolation preserved those patterns, while the rest of the English-speaking world moved on. Americans who hear it think it sounds British. British people think it sounds American. The islanders have been speaking it for so long that the question of authenticity has long since stopped being interesting to them. The graveyard at Canaan, on Tangier's north shore, tells the island's story more clearly than anything else. The graves date back to the earliest settlement period, but the graveyard is on the water's edge, and the water keeps coming. A gravestone that stood on solid ground 100 years ago now sits on the Chesapeake Bay floor. The grave markers of Tangier's founding families are being claimed by the same water their descendants fish every morning. Since 1850, Tangier Island has lost between 67 and 75% of its land area. The island's highest point is approximately 5 feet above sea level. A study published in the journal Frontiers in Climate found that even if coastal erosion were stopped completely today, sea level rise alone would render the island uninhabitable by approximately 2051. The study estimated it would cost approximately $150 million to relocate the island's residents, and as much as $350 million to protect the shoreline sufficiently to make continued habitation viable. No funding for either option has materialized. The Royal Marines built Fort Albion on Tangier Island in 1814 during the War of 1812, using the island as a staging base for operations against the American coast. They offered freedom to enslaved Americans who escaped to the island, and many did, reaching Tangier, enlisting in the Royal Marines, and eventually relocating to British colonies in the Caribbean. Fort Albion is now completely underwater. The fortification that the British built on Tangier Island in 1814 is on the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay. The same water that took the fort is taking the graveyard. The same water that is taking the graveyard is taking the island. The ferry still comes from Reedville once a day. The watermen still go out for crabs before dawn. The dialect that the Crockett family brought from Cornwall in 1686 is still spoken on streets wide enough for 2 golf carts to pass each other. The grave markers of the founding families are on the bay floor. The island that Captain John Smith noted in 1608 will, in all probability, not be habitable by the middle of this century. The community that has been there since 1686 is watching the water come, in small measurable increments, year after year, knowing that the increments add up and knowing what the total means. Sapelo Island is a barrier island on the Georgia coast, approximately 12 miles north of where Cumberland Island's ferry departs, accessible only by a 20-minute ferry from the small town of Meridian in McIntosh County. The ferry operates on a schedule so limited that arriving visitors are advised to plan carefully, because the last ferry back doesn't wait for anyone running late. There is one departure point. There is one schedule. The ferry is the boundary of the island's relationship with the mainland. The island has approximately 50 permanent residents. They are the descendants of enslaved West Africans who were brought to Sapelo in the early 19th century to work the Sea Island cotton plantation of Thomas Spalding. the island's dominant landowner. Spalding operated a plantation that, at its peak, held hundreds of enslaved people, cultivating a long staple cotton variety that grew nowhere else in the country with equal success. When the Civil War ended and Sapelo's enslaved population was freed, they did not leave. The community of Hog Hammock, the only inhabited settlement remaining on Sapelo Island today, is what those families built in the decades after 1865, on land they were able to acquire and hold through a combination of legal effort, community solidarity, and the fortunate fact that Sapelo Island's geographic isolation made it economically marginal enough that the forces that displaced Gullah Geechee communities elsewhere found Sapelo inconvenient to bother with fully. The island required a ferry. The ferry created friction. The friction was enough. The people of Hog Hammock are Gullah Geechee, a term that describes the distinct culture developed by the descendants of enslaved West Africans on the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia, where geographic isolation from the mainland created the conditions for a culture, a language, and a way of life that absorbed the surrounding American world selectively and maintained what it chose to maintain. The Gullah Geechee language is a Creole, not a dialect of English but its own language, with its own grammar, vocabulary, and phonology, developed from the contact between multiple West African languages and English in conditions that the linguist would later describe as accidental preservation through geographic accident. The isolation of the Sea Islands in the years after emancipation preserved what the mainland could not, a language that West African captives had developed among themselves as a means of communication across tribal boundaries that the enslaved population of the Sea Islands shared no common language to bridge otherwise. On Sapelo Island, the Gullah Geechee language and the traditions that accompany it, sweetgrass basket weaving, net fishing techniques, specific cooking traditions, the particular character of a community that has maintained its coherence over 150 years despite everything that has worked against that maintenance, survived because the ferry to Meridian runs on a limited schedule, and the island attracted, through most of the 20th century, no one with the means and motivation to overwhelm what was there. The sweetgrass baskets made by the women of Hog Hammock are sold in Savannah and Charleston and on the internet. The weaving technique, the specific handling of the sweetgrass harvested from the island's marshes, the particular way the coils are formed and joined, is continuous with what the 19th century community did, which was continuous with what the 18th century enslaved craftswomen did, which was continuous with the basket weaving traditions that the women who were brought across the Atlantic carried in their hands and their memory from West Africa to a barrier island in Georgia. In 1934, Richard Reynolds of the Reynolds tobacco family purchased Sapelo Island as a private retreat. He developed the island's research infrastructure and maintained it until 1969, when he sold most of the island to the state of Georgia. The Sapelo Island National Estuarine Research Reserve now administers most of the island's acreage. The community of Hog Hammock sits on privately held land within the state reserve, land that the community has held since the years after 1865, when they first acquired it. The ferry from Meridian runs on a schedule that limits casual access. Hog Hammock has approximately 50 residents, an average age that reflects a community losing its young people to the mainland's opportunities. The sweetgrass still grows in the same marshes where it has always grown. The baskets are still being made. The language is still spoken by fewer people every year in a community that has survived on a Georgia barrier island for 150 years since emancipation, maintained its culture against odds that would seem overwhelming if the outcome were not sitting there demonstrating that survival is possible. The ferry to Meridian leaves on a limited schedule. The sweetgrass grows in the marsh. The baskets are still being woven. Ossabaw Island is 20 miles south of Savannah, Georgia, across Ossabaw Sound, accessible only by private boat. There is no ferry, no public transportation, no scheduled service of any kind. The island is 26,000 acres, which makes it roughly the size of a small American city, and it has no permanent human residence. It has not had any since 2021, when Eleanor Torrey West, who had lived on Ossabaw for most of her life and was its last private owner, died on the island at the age of 108. This is what it takes, apparently, to keep a place unchanged. 26,000 acres, no ferry, no permanent residence, and one woman who lived to 108 and spent every year of her adult life preventing the island from becoming what everything around it became. The human history of Ossabaw Island goes back at least 5,000 years. The Mississippian culture had settlements here around 1000 CE. The Gullah people, the indigenous inhabitants of coastal Georgia, used the island for fishing, farming, and seasonal habitation long before European contact. Their presence is documented in the oyster shell middens that remain visible near tidal creeks. Essentially the accumulated waste of centuries of feasts. The organic evidence that people lived here and ate well and left the shells where they fell. Spanish explorers arrived on Ossabaw in 1526 as part of the first European expedition to the present-day United States, predating Jamestown by 81 years and the Pilgrims at Plymouth by 94 years. Spanish missionaries operated on the island during the 17th century. The Spanish colonial presence left two legacies that are still visible on Ossabaw today: the ruins of the mission system and the feral hogs. The Spanish brought their own hogs across the Atlantic as a food source, as they did throughout their colonial enterprise in the Americas, and the descendants of those hogs are still on Ossabaw Island in 2026, 4.5 centuries after the Spanish explorers carried their ancestors across an ocean. The hogs root up the dunes and eat the eggs of loggerhead sea turtles. A state employee's full-time job on Ossabaw is managing the hog population to protect the turtles. The Spanish colonial legacy on Ossabaw Island is a wildlife management problem. The island was cultivated as a plantation during the colonial and antebellum periods, worked by enslaved people whose descendants, after 1865, either joined the Gullah Geechee communities of the nearby islands or moved to the Georgia mainland. The island changed private hands several times in the 19th and early 20th centuries before Harry Norton Torrey and Nell Ford Torrey purchased it in 1924, constructed a 20,000 square foot Spanish colonial revival mansion overlooking Ossabaw Sound, and established the island as their family's winter home. Harry Ford, of the Ford Motor Company, was the first signature in the mansion's guest book. The first signature in the guest book of a private island that would later become Georgia's first heritage preserve belongs to the man who more than anyone else shaped the automobile-dependent America that Ossabaw Island has been protected from ever since. When the Torreys died, the island passed to their daughter, Eleanor Sandy Torrey West, and to the children of their late son. Eleanor West was in her early 40s when she inherited her share of Ossabaw, and she spent the next 6 decades making it into something. In 1961, she established the Ossabaw Island Project, an artist, scientist, and scholar residency program that brought carefully selected individuals from across the disciplines to Ossabaw for extended working retreats. The program ran for nearly 20 years and produced work by Alice Walker, Cormac McCarthy, Paget Powell, and dozens of others who came to Ossabaw because Eleanor West believed, correctly, the evidence suggests, that extended time in a genuinely wild place, with no distractions, produced something in writers and scientists and artists that a university residency or a city apartment simply couldn't. In 1970, she established the Genesis Project, focused on environmental studies and ecology research, bringing participants who lived in structures they built themselves at the island's middle place and studied the island's ecosystems from within them. In 1978, when the Ossabaw Island Foundation could no longer subsidize all of these programs, Eleanor West made the decision that defined everything that came after. She sold Ossabaw Island to the state of Georgia at 50% of its appraised value, under an agreement that established it as Georgia's first heritage preserve, dedicated to natural, scientific, and cultural research and education in perpetuity. She negotiated for herself a life estate of the family mansion and its immediately surrounding grounds, retaining the right to live on Ossabaw for the remainder of her life. The remainder of her life turned out to be 43 more years. She lived full-time on Ossabaw until she was 103, returned each year after that, and died on the island on January 17, 2021, her 108th birthday. She had been offered resort development deals throughout the 1960s and 1970s, as the Georgia Barrier Islands became some of the most coveted development real estate on the East Coast. She turned them all down. The island she could have sold to make herself and her family extraordinarily wealthy is instead a 26,000-acre heritage preserve where 13 miles of beach are open to the public. Hundreds of loggerhead sea turtles nest each summer on dark beaches that have no artificial light to disorient them, and the maritime forest that once covered the Georgia coast exists in something close to its pre-contact character because no one cleared it for a golf course. The loggerhead turtles that nest on Ossabaw's beaches, 22,063 hatchlings in a recent season, by the count of Georgia Turtle Conservation Program interns who inventory the nests, require darkness to orient to the water after hatching. The beach is dark because there is nothing on it that needs to be lit. There is nothing on it that needs to be lit because Eleanor West turned down the resort deals. The turtles exist on Ossabaw's beach in the numbers they do because of a decision that one woman made over and over for 60 years. The feral Sicilian donkeys on the island's interior, brought by some previous owner for reasons that history doesn't clearly document, are the subject of ongoing genetic studies by researchers who visit the island on the Ossabaw Island Foundation's monthly day trips. The feral horses run on the open ground. The Spanish hogs root through the dunes. The alligators inhabit the freshwater ponds. The Ossabaw Island Foundation brings approximately 1,000 people a year to the island through organized day trips that operate roughly once a month. The offerings include indigo dyeing workshops. Indigo was grown on Ossabaw during the plantation period, and the plant still grows on the island. Historical walking tours of the mission ruins and the plantation-era structures, and turtle hatching events in August, when researchers from the Georgia Turtle Conservation Program invite participants to accompany them as they inventory the loggerhead nests and document the season's hatchlings. In August 2024, there were 22,063 loggerhead hatchlings on Ossabaw's beaches. Each one made its way from its nest across the sand to the water, oriented by the darkness of the beach and the reflected light of the Atlantic, exactly as loggerhead turtles have been doing on this coastline for millions of years. The beaches of the Georgia Barrier Islands were once all like this. Most of them are now lit by resort hotels, condominiums, and the streetlights of developed communities. Ossabaw's beaches are still dark. The turtles still find their way to the water. The mansion that Harry Norton Torrey built in 1926, a Spanish colonial revival structure of 20,000 square feet, designed in the style of a Spanish colonial estate, overlooking Ossabaw Sound from a rise above the island's interior, is still standing, still being restored by the Ossabaw Island Foundation, with grants and private donations. The interior contains the furniture and objects of the Torrey family's decades of winter residence, among them the guest book with Henry Ford's signature at the front. The mansion where the creator of the automobile left the first signature is on an island that no automobile has ever reached. Eleanor West lived in the mansion until she was 103. She moved to the Georgia mainland for the last years of her life, but continued to visit the island. She died on January 17, 2021, her 108th birthday. Some accounts say she died at the stroke of midnight, a detail that may be exact, or may have been shaped by the island's tendency to produce stories that are as good as they need to be. She is buried on Ossabaw. The foundation she established is still there. The turtles are still nesting on the dark beach. The Spanish hogs are still a management problem. The maritime forest is still what it was before anyone cleared it. Every island on this list survived by a different mechanism. Little Cranberry Island survived because the fishing was good enough and the people stubborn enough to stay through Maine winters for 250 years. and because a man who loved the island as a child came back and built a protection organization in 1954, before the development that he had watched reach everywhere else could reach the island he had grown up on. Monhegan Island survived because the painters came. Rockwell Kent, Edward Hopper, George Bellows, and their documentation of the island's specific light made it into something that subsequent generations understood was worth protecting. And then the son of Thomas Edison came back from his childhood summers on Monhegan and did something concrete about it. Ocracoke Island survived because no bridge was ever built, and the ferry that began in 1957 replaced a 200-year period of practical isolation, during which the island developed a dialect that has no parallel anywhere else on Earth, and a community whose surnames go back to the same families who were there when Blackbeard was using the inlet as his hiding place. Cumberland Island survived because in 1970, a conservation organization noticed that a developer was cutting trees on a Georgia barrier island and alerted newspapers before the window for stopping it closed. The law that President Nixon signed in 1972 is the reason the beach is still 18 miles long and undeveloped, and the Carnegie Mansion ruins are still what they are, rather than a site cleared for a resort. Smith Island survived because the watermen kept going out for crabs, the women kept making the layered cake, the congregation kept not going out on Sunday, and nobody arrived with sufficient money or sufficient reason to change any of those three things. The island is sinking. The community is still there. Tangier Island survived in the sense that it is still there, still inhabited, still spoken over by the dialect that Cornish settlers brought in 1686. The science says it will be gone before the middle of this century. The water that has taken 67 to 75% of the island since 1850 will take the rest. The graveyard is already on the bay floor. Sapelo Island survived because the ferry to Meridian runs on a limited schedule, and the Gullah Geechee community of Hog Hammock held its ground after 1865 through legal effort and communal solidarity, and the basket weaving, and the language and the cooking traditions that the community's founders brought from West Africa to a Georgia barrier island in the 18th century are still there, still practiced, still handed from one generation to the next on a 20-minute ferry ride from the mainland. And Ossabaw Island survived because Eleanor West lived to 108 and spent every year of her adult life making sure that what she had was still what it had been when she inherited it, and then built the legal structure that would protect it after she was gone. She sold it to the state at half its appraised value. She turned down the resort deals. She died on the island on her 108th birthday. The loggerhead turtles still come to the dark beaches to nest. The Spanish hogs are still a wildlife management problem. The maritime forest is still what it was before anyone tried to clear it. Eleanor West is buried on the island. What connects all 8 of these places is not natural beauty, though all of them have it, and not historical significance, though all of them have that too. What connects them is that the modern world, in each case, either couldn't reach them, chose not to, or was stopped before it could transform them completely. And in the space that was left by the ferry that doesn't run in winter, by the developer who was turned back, by the woman who lived to 108, by the watermen who go out before dawn for the same crabs in the same water, something was preserved that the rest of America's coastline lost. Not the past. The past is gone everywhere. What was preserved is the knowledge that the coast can still look like this, that there are still places where the ferry schedule is the primary constraint on your day, that there are still people speaking dialects that centuries of isolation produced, that there are still turtles coming to dark beaches to nest, still watermen going out before dawn on the Chesapeake that has been providing crabs since 1686, still a language in Hog Hammock that began in West Africa and arrived in Georgia under the worst possible circumstances and survived anyway. These things exist. They are not performances. They are the residue of specific decisions, some deliberate, some accidental, some imposed by geography, that kept the modern world far enough away that something else could persist. Think about what it means that Ocracoke Island didn't get electricity until 1938 and didn't get a regular ferry until 1957. That means there are people alive today whose parents grew up on Ocracoke without electricity and without a scheduled way off the island. That's not ancient history, that's a living memory. The dialect those people speak. The dialect that sounds like Cornish English, filtered through 2 centuries of isolation, developed under conditions that ended within living memory. The island became accessible within living memory. The Brogue developed under conditions of isolation that ended within living memory. And the Brogue is still there. Think about what it means that the families on Tangier Island have been crabbing the same Chesapeake Bay water since 1686. That's 340 years. America has been a country for 250 years. The watermen of Tangier Island were working the Chesapeake for 90 years before the United States existed. The country came after the crabbing, and the crabbing is still happening. The island is sinking, and the crabbing is still happening, and the dialect is still spoken, and the graves of the founding families are on the bay floor, and the descendants of those founding families are still on the island. Think about what it means that Eleanor West turned down the resort developers in the 1960s and 1970s and sold the island to the state at half its appraised value in 1978. The Georgia Barrier Islands were some of the most coveted real estate in the American South at that moment. Hilton Head had already been transformed. Sea Island had already been developed. Jekyll Island was already a state park being carefully managed. Ossabaw could have been any of those things. It could have been sold at full value and developed and made into a resort destination that would have generated significant wealth for the Tory family. Eleanor West chose not to. She was in her 60s when she made that choice. She had 43 more years to live with it. She chose correctly, and then she lived long enough to see that she had chosen correctly, which is a kind of justice that doesn't always arrive. The turtle numbers on Ossabaw's beaches are what they are because of a decision made in 1978. The dialect on Ocracoke is what it is because no bridge was built. The sweetgrass baskets in Hog Hammock are what they are because the ferry to Meridian runs on a limited schedule. The 60 people on Little Cranberry Island in January are who they are because the fishing has been good enough for long enough that the families who came in 1768 kept coming back after every winter. The ruins of the Carnegie Mansion on Cumberland Island are what they are because a conservation organization noticed in 1970 and someone made a phone call to a newspaper. Small decisions, specific people, particular moments when the modern world was heading in one direction and someone, a woman who lived to 108, a conservation organization that made a phone call, a community that held its land after emancipation, a village council in 1898 that voted to ban the automobile, made a different choice. The coast can still look like this. It does, in these 8 places, because of choices that were made and choices that were refused. Subscribe for more of the America that stayed. New videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.